Thanks and good morning. I'm assuming that they asked the man to go first so that a man didn't have the last word on this panel. But I start with deep admiration and respect for all the work that all of you represent. And I think yesterday was a reminder of why I got into this field more than 20 years ago, which is working with Brazilian feminists around the time of the Cairo event on population and development, where the question was, where are men and what are men doing here? And one of the events that I got to participate with some colleagues in Brazil, I said, and what is the flag that men will carry? And I still remember a colleague who is a friend and ally all these years later who said, we've been doing your laundry, we've been picking up after you. You want us to define what men have to do for gender equality. Perhaps you could define that yourselves. So I took that. I once thought we had a checklist and that there was somehow a good answer to that question. But I think I've come to learn from all of you that this is a process and we are learning and it is a challenge and there is no right answer. We're trying to figure it out. And I'm thrilled to get to share some reflections on this question. And I was asked to comment on where are men in this MeToo moment. There's no easy answer to that. But I want to, if anything, to make it nuanced and to say where there's some ways forward based on what I think is a lot of confusion in lots of men's minds. So if we ask this big question, we should, for those of us who are struggling with where are we in the world we can name some of our leaders, and there's a lot of bees going on between Brexit and Boris and Bolsonaro and what's happening in my other home country of the US. In spite of all that, we should at least give ourselves, you all should give yourselves some credit that these decades of women's rights activism are shaping young men's minds anyway in different ways. As we've looked around the world, there's a generation of younger men who at least on some measures are more likely to believe in gender equality. But it depends on how you ask them. So if we compare the young adult men to their fathers or their grandfather's generation, there's a slow and pretty deliberate move toward we think women and girls are pretty much our equals. Now, if we shift those questions around and ask, are you willing to support quotas in universities or government jobs? Are you willing to give up some amount of power and privilege? That support goes considerably down. If we ask questions about if you're involved in a relationship with a woman, do you think you need to know where she goes? And you have some say over what happens in her life, we find that those men who say they believe in gender equality, to the tune of 40 to 80% say yes, they need to know where she is all the time. So this is a really confusing picture of where men are, and it's not as if there's a line here and you're on the gender equitable side or the non-gender equitable side. It's moving all the time. We've been asking these questions in household surveys and qualitative research, one with a study called the International Men and Gender Equality Survey that we've carried out in more than 40 countries around the world. Lots of interviews with men and women about where men are in their practices and attitudes on this. And then more recently, a set of studies we've called the Man Box, around this, how do these norms and power structures shape men themselves of younger groups, and that's been carried out in a fewer number of countries. And then I'll also reflect on some results from a study looking at how misogyny shows up on the internet and how it manifests itself in multiple ways. So I'm drawing on several data sets. It's a lot. There's only a few minutes, so I'm just going to give some big headlines. One, as I said before, we do see younger men kind of buying into this stuff somewhat, depending on how we ask them. Not so in settings where there's been deliberate political efforts to engage men to create a backlash against this. And we know many of those countries around the world. Where men feel their economic prospects are at risk or questioned, we see a lot of anti or misogynistic language showing up again. And we're finding this very confused issue that on the one hand, lots of men say, yeah, women are mostly our equals these days and I should support it. But at the same time, this frightening resurgence of a tough guy version of masculinity that seemed that we had put it to rest, or at least it seemed to be weakened somewhat, but it certainly has made and reared its ugly head again. What's also clear to us is how much social media and internet becomes a non-policed lack of social control space where we see a lot of the worst behaviors and attitudes of men. And I think it's also important to notice that lots of men who say they wouldn't do other kinds of violence, but are practicing sexual harassment in large, large amounts. And I think finally we need to talk about, if we've not seen any evidence that there's a decline in violence in women's lives, we use a lot of violence to make violent men every single day. And certainly our research finding just how much men's lives and boys' lives are filled with violence from other men. So let's start with one question that comes up in the MeToo. Well, that's just a few of those men, right? And I think it's important to say, and our research has shown just how much this is not just a few men. When we ask men to disclose their use of different forms of harassment, we're seeing that 1 in 5 to 1 in 3 have practiced some form of virtual or real-life harassment in the last month, where we've asked young men. This has become, in some parts of the world, you could call it a national sport of young men, and particularly some of what they might consider casual. Well, that didn't really hurt very much, did it? It was just a comment online of just how much this is not only the behavior of a handful of men. The men most likely to carry out this harassment are those, as I said before, who buy into this tough guy version of masculinity. The more, using a set of questions that we called the man box, the more you are in the box, believing in this version of manhood where you can't stop and ask for help, you can't show fear, can't show anxiety, all those things, the more likely you are to harass. That, more important than education, than age, and lots of other factors, was, do you believe in this tough guy version of manhood? Another question we've asked, no question that as we've looked at multiple studies, MeToo has made an impact in men. Men are paying attention. Some are worried they're going to get called out. Some are worried they're going to get called out falsely. Some are worried that somehow some amount of power or privilege is going to be taken from them. Some men, to their credit, are saying, yes, we need to pay more attention to this. This isn't just the behavior of other men, and I get to sit here and say, well, that's not me, and not all men argument is not enough. So we've asked men in one survey of men in the workplace, men and women, asked kind of how men have changed their behaviors. On the good side, 89% of men that we asked in a survey about 3 months ago, would you be a good listener? Would you know how to respond if a woman in your workplace came to you with an incident of sexual harassment? 89% of men said, I would. Interestingly, women were less enthused or less supportive that men actually knew how to do that. Women said, 58% said they thought men in their workplace would actually respond positively if they were to report or tell him about a case of sexual harassment. Interestingly, both men and women, and I'll come back to this point toward the end, acknowledged that how much it is difficult for men, particularly men in junior positions, to speak out on these issues. That is an acknowledgement that some men speaking out on these issues brings risk as well, and that patriarchy also works to say men who aren't at the top aren't allowed to question those who are. I think it's also important that our research and many others, finding how much and making visible, and if anything, the toxic masculinity phrase, and toxic was the word of the year in 2018, according to Oxford Dictionary, often accompanied by toxic masculinity or toxic workplace, is getting a lot of attention. What we have trouble in the backlash is helping men see that toxic masculinity eats us up from the inside as well. So if we look at the more you're in this tough guy version of manhood, the more harm you cause women around you. At the same time, men who are in this man box cause harm to themselves. They're more likely to have thought about suicide. They're more likely to have a depressive symptom. They're more likely to binge drink and carry out a number of other behaviors that cause harm to us as men as well. And I think part of what we're trying to do is make that visible, to say we're all in this about questioning toxic masculinity. This is not a favor for women as much as it needs to be done in that direction as well, because it's right and just, but also to take a moment of self-reflection, to step down from that backlash anger and acknowledge how this causes harm to us as well. So with that affirmation that we should all have a common stake in this change, I want to talk about kind of how it is that we make boys so. If you spent any time with younger boys, the ideas about manhood that the world is inculcating in them don't come with our male bodies when we come into the world. These are made things. And that may seem obvious, but I think we're doing a listening project at the moment with younger boys, ages 8 to 15. And the 8 to 12-year-olds are amazing in terms of their desire to be in the world with their full selves, to be full-hearted, to express what they feel, to be connected, to show empathy and solidarity in ways that we want human beings of all kinds to show. And if we ask them about manhood and what does it mean, the words don't I want to beat the other up. I want to put the other in their place. I want to show my dominance. They're words like this, of kind and nice and helpful. And you can, for a moment, feel a glimpse of hope in the world in these rather challenging moments. Now, we talk to the 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and something starts to shift. And there we get just how much this version of manhood and patriarchy polices not only women's bodies, but how it also polices the behavior and bodies of men. And that's where the boys say how much they feel like they have to shut down, and particularly when it's talking about emotions or vulnerability or fear. One boy said, sharing feelings makes you look weak and vulnerable. People will take that vulnerability and use it against you. By which he meant people, he means other guys for the most part, and often older guys. So I think it's important just to acknowledge how does this man box, to use a less sociological term than patriarchy, work to police boys who would try to be fuller, connected, more justice-driven individuals in our daily lives. And I think the other piece is to acknowledge, again, how much violence is made and reproduced in boys' lives. And this survey about online bullying and violence, just a sample of some of the questions that we asked about the violence in boys' lives. 63% said they had ever experienced physical violence from another male. 5% had experienced that in the last month. 3/4 had been bullied because of the way they dressed. 3/4 had experienced rumors or gossip about them. 41% reported being excluded from a social group that they cared about because of the way they dressed. 42% experienced homophobic bullying. About 10% reported that they were same-sex attracted. So just to give you a sense of the way that this policing works and how it weighs in the minds, although we are not allowed to talk about it as men, how much that policing and that judging and the gaze of other men weighs on us as men as well, and how well patriarchy works to keep us from men to acknowledge how much we have in connection with women in a shared stake in achieving this change. Just another example of gloom before I'll get to where we can go on this is the fear of questioning these ideas. We've asked men, when you see harm being carried out, if you see another man harassing or bullying, do you feel motivated to do something about it? More than 80% say they do. Although the stone looks that we often give as men, we are aware of what's happening around us. We see the violence. We are moved, and as humans, we're connected to the pain that others and the injustices that others suffer. But 89% of men said, I would do nothing because I'm fearful of the violence that would come to me. That bullying, that harassment, that anger, that violence that I see happening to the other, we're very good at saying, I won't say anything about it because I'm worried that it will come in my direction, because we as men have seen the violence of other men. So we've got a very challenging system to break out of and help men break out of this silence to move ahead on it. So what do I think we should do? One, we've got to start very early. We've got to start with how patriarchy works itself into the psyches of boys and girls very early on. To call out men when they're adults and the top of the food chain is way, way too late. How do we take MeToo to much earlier ages? Involving caregivers and parents, not to blame them, but to help them be part of this change, to understand how much we make those attitudes every day. And of course, we've got to work with the celebrities and the gatekeepers and the media content makers. We've just been doing a review of some of the TV shows that boys are watching. And again, a preliminary finding finds how much they're seeing women in leadership positions, on the one hand, which is good news, and on the same time, how much they see violent versions of manhood enacted in almost all of these shows that they're watching. And of course, doing this together, this work has to be together with women and girls and listening and finding the shared and common experiences as well as the different ones that need to be there. Empowering boys and men's resistance. Every man, if we can get a conversation going, can tell moments of resistance against violence that we've seen or oppression carried out by other men. How are we making spaces so that we allow that resistance and encourage that resistance to be told, including being inspired by the courage that those of you in the room represent around that? Making masculinity a part of the conversations. It's too easy in a MeToo moment or as corporate workplaces work on, you've done the 45-minute PowerPoint on sexual harassment, now you're done. And no discussion of gender, masculinity, power, privilege, that we've got to make those central parts of our conversation. And then to acknowledge, as I've said several times, around the issue of our common but far different experiences around how violence shapes our lives too much from the very beginning of those lives, and how can we find a common cause in that. And I would just one nod to Iceland as among other things that Iceland wins around the gender equality measures is the most participation by men in the hands-on caregiving of children. And to try to think of other more radical ways that we try to disrupt the binary, getting men to do our share of the hands-on care of children, not just the fun and smiley moments, but the messy bits that parenthood is all about, and really to readjust our lives so that we take seriously that as a driver of the gender binary. And just because I like to use that picture as well, to show, in fact, what we have pulsing inside of us as men in spite of what the world tries to turn us into. And as a final point, I think it's important to say we've done a lot of calling men out, and we're not done with that, but I think we've done less to call men in to what we mean by healthy, positive, and I don't even think we need to say positive masculinity because I think it's a weird term, but let's just say call men into what we think humanity needs to look like. Thanks very much.